can we start with a prayer? Lord, thank you for this time together, and this friendship and this fellowship, and this time of discussion and inquiry. It is good. Thank you for this church and for all the folks here and for the worship and the service. Thank you for all of our blessings. Our blessings are particularly acute right now, since there's so much difficulty and problems in the world, so much fear. Bless us as a world and as a people. Give us courage, give us insight. Bless us as we struggle to make this world good. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ, who is Lord and Savior. Amen. Okay, yeah. This is gonna be a little different today.
Well, wait a minute. I'm sitting in a different chair.
That's it, because Jeanette's in a different chair, usually she's there. And I'm just having to get left and right and all straight here.
I think she's gonna take my end, in the chair. Okay. It's all because Robin and I messed it up.
Yeah.
That's all right, I forgave you.
Thank you. And I'm leaving in 15 minutes.
Okay.
Orchestra, so.
I'm gonna read more than we're gonna cover today. I'm gonna read from 2:11 all the way to 3:7.
In what?
Peter. In First Peter,
Okay.
chapter 2, verse 11 through 3, verse 7. This is what is called, we've read one before, a household code. We ran into that when we studied Titus. And we also saw it in some other places. And it's one of the most poorly interpreted of all the Bible. You'll see why when I start reading it. And it just happens that it coincides with my completing a history book of Rome. That's probably the best history book I have read in many, many years. It took me 3 months to read it. It's not for novices, but it's really good. It's called SPQR by Mary Beard, and it's quite an extraordinary book that I know. It's good if you know a bit about Roman history, which I do, more than most people. But this, so you probably, to really enjoy it, need to have some kind of understanding of Roman history. So with that, I'm going to start with 2:11. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that, though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. For the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether the emperor as supreme or the governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. It is God's will that by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. As servants of God, live as free people, yet do not use your freedom as a pretext for evil. Honor everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but those who are harsh. For it is a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is it? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Wives, in the same way, accept the authority of your husbands, so that if some of them do not obey the word, they may be won over without a word by their wives' conduct, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Do not adorn yourselves outwardly by braiding your hair and by wearing gold ornaments or fine clothing. Rather, let your adornment be the inner self with the lasting beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in God's sight. It was in this way long ago that the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by accepting the authority of their husbands. Thus Sarah obeyed Abraham and called him Lord. You have become her daughters as long as you do what is good and never let fears alarm you. Husbands, in the same way, show consideration of your wives in your life together. Paying honor to the women as the weaker sex, since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing may hinder your prayers. Okay, this passage, and amongst others similar to it, this is a household code. This is it appears is a whole bunch of times in the New Testament, in Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, 1 Timothy 2. We looked at that last year. Titus, and here in Peter. So, what are they? Well, let me start here. I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against your soul. Now, aliens there, it means sojourner. It is a old, is a very old notion in the Old Testament. Sojourners were given in the land were people who were not Hebrew. And so, but they were given rights and they were welcomed. And that's a fundamental premise of Judaism from the very beginning. Exiles are people who are estranged from their land. Now, in this particular case, they are aliens. When he talks about aliens and exiles, sojourners are sojourners in this context in this world, and in the world as we know it, and they're exiles from the kingdom of God. So this is addressed to Christians, not Jews, and the world is the source of temptations that are endangered to spiritual life. Now that's the premise. Okay. Then he goes on to say, consider yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. That's 1 Peter 2:12. Now, this lays out what this is all about. Consider yourselves honorably, conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they may malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. Now, here's something that it's hard for us to grasp, and that is the difficulty of being a Christian in the Roman Empire. And so we've never done this before, but I'm going to spend a good deal of the class today talking about what it meant to live in Rome in this era. So you can try to give you a sense of what that meant politically, socially, culturally, religiously, because it turns out that Christians are a problem to the Romans. And so it was ultimately dangerous, but not at this time. But it was certainly uncomfortable because Christians and the Jews separated themselves from the culture, from ordinary culture. And so they're outsiders. Now, the Jews have been around for a very long time, and they're outsiders because they refuse to submit to the cultural norms, particularly the authority norms. The Jews had made a place for themselves that over the centuries, really, and the Romans had accepted the Jews as legitimate. And they even gave them special privileges. They didn't have to serve in the military. They didn't have to pay taxes to Rome. And they didn't have to sacrifice to the Roman gods, particularly the emperor. So they did that on the grounds that the Jewish religion was ancient, older than the Roman. This Judaism goes back, if you start from the time of the law till about 1200. Earlier, if you go back to Abraham, Rome began as a city in about 750 and became the Roman Republic in about 500, something about 500. So the Jews had made a place for themselves. Christians were seen originally and considered themselves originally as a subset of the Jews, but we see by the end of Acts, when Paul's in Rome, that by this time the church is separated from Judaism, what I call the Great Divorce there in the end of Acts, and it's separated from the Jews and become their separate, had become a separate religion, and they also separated themselves from the rest of society and were therefore not well accepted because they didn't want to do that.
Was Peter living in Rome at that?
Jews were, we know that Jews, in fact, Peter's writing from Rome.
We know Peter's
Yeah.
writing from Rome.
But this is also true of the whole Roman Empire. So what I want to do, I just happened to finish this excellent history. It's take some time now to explain why it's necessary to, let me go back and say one more thing. These household codes are designed to be an instruction on how you could live in the empire as a Christian without causing trouble. And you could cause trouble. You could get yourself in serious trouble. So they needed help. And so that's what these household codes are about. And we have to understand that because a lot of this stuff is taken literally today. For instance, this part about slavery was used 150 years ago to rationalize, to prove that slaves were God's will for people, for this country. And to this very day, there are many who say that the duty of the wife is to be subordinate and subservient to their husband. This is just two of the elements of the household codes. There's more in the other codes. And we'll look at them very briefly. later. The context, when you look at this in context, it's something else. The question before us here, this household code is how to get along in the Roman Empire. So, so let me talk about Rome. And first, let me talk about our sources of knowledge of Rome. We have just a huge amount of writing of this era. Starting with the Greeks and their philosophers and their poetry with Homer, 750, and then their philosophers, and then historians, and then those kinds of traditions were picked up by Rome. So there was a whole lot of writing, history writing, whole lot of commentary, huge amount of letters, and a lot of inscriptions, cemetery epitaphs and stuff like that. So we have just a huge amount, much of it on frangible, on delicate materials such as paper, hide, etc. And so it didn't last very long. And it's not a kind of place like Egypt where a papyrus can get buried in the sand and stay dry and you could open it up 2,000, 3,000 years later. That kind of stuff died in the Roman climate and the climate of the Roman Empire in general. So what happened is that some of it was preserved, and it was preserved by being copied. The copyists were the Christians. So by definition, by practice, almost all of great resources are Christian. And so they would copy some of the stuff from the Greeks and from the Romans, but not all of it. Matter of fact, not most of it. And they would copy it because they had an interest to them. It concerned the church. For instance, we have lots of stuff from Josephus, right? Well, Josephus was a Jew. And he did histories of the Jews, and he copied traditions of the Bible, and got all kinds of great stuff. Outside the Bible itself, Josephus is our major source of Judaism and early Christianity in the Bible. Josephus, you will recall, was a general during the Jewish general during the AD revolt of AD 66 to 70, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem. He surrendered. He was in Galilee. He surrendered and became a favorite of Vespasian, who was the general there, and eventually became the emperor. And he wrote a lot, went to Rome. He wrote a lot for Romans. And it was preserved by the church. But other stuff that tells us about the Roman Empire and the other religions and other stuff that just crumbled. So we have to be very aware that our sources are heavily oriented favorably towards Christianity. And therefore Judaism as well. So that's our major consideration. There are a lot of other sources too. There are lots of monuments. People would, you have these arches, great arches the Roman emperors would put up and there would be a lot of writing on them. There would be monuments to people, monuments to all kinds of folks, and frequently they would be autobiographical. Person would put up there, this is what I did. And that goes all the way back to pharaohs. So that's normal. But then there are a lot of burial inscriptions, epitaphs. We have these all over, in which we would have information about a wife and how she lived her life, and a man or a son, and sometimes these were quite extensive. And this is our major source of information about people who are not the elites. Most of the writing refers to the elites, not to the ordinary person in Rome or the person out farming somewhere. Those are ancillary references. So we need to understand what our sources are, because we don't really have enough information to like a newspaper to tell us what was really going on, but we can infer a lot.
Is it true that probably only the elites could read and write, perhaps?
No,
That's not
they
true?
more than the elites could read and write.
Okay,
When you get into urban areas like Rome, a significant number of the population can read and write because of commerce.
okay.
There's a whole lot of commerce, writing and stuff like that, contracts, etc. So that, and it's probably as much as, I've read that as much as 20% of the men in the empire could read and write. That's a fairly high, but it's probably more in Palestine, incidentally, because of the law. People read the law. Any rate, so reading, probably less than writing, but reading, yeah, there's a reasonable number of people could read and write. And so there was a lot of that significant amount of people who would read this stuff. So the period we're talking about is Jesus was born in 4 BC. We're clear about that. And the New Testament extends till about 100. Maybe some of the writings are a little bit after, but we're talking about a century, 100 years period here. And so let's talk about how the Roman Empire, Rome, overlapped. And Rome was established as a city somewhere in the 700s. In the late 500s, 550 something, Rome became a republic. And that's very clear. They have a very clear founding date. Up until that time, it was a monarchy. And the monarchy was overthrown because they abused their power. And they set up this republic in about 500 BC. It was very involved. It was it originally was just the Senate. And the Senate elected officers, consuls, to lead. Always, they were very clear about abuse of power. So the Senate would always elect 2 consuls yearly. You couldn't keep at it. You can't elect the consuls more than one time, but they couldn't do it for very long. They could only hold it for a year, but could be reelected year after. These consuls were given executive authority and exclusive as executive authority in times of emergency, particularly war. And so that was the major office, and there were a whole bunch of minor offices. Yes.
Did the relationship with the military change as the government changed from the monarchy to the republic?
Not to republic? Well, no, not, well, yeah. What happened was that the Roman citizen, if you were a citizen of Rome, you were a soldier. And you served in the military. And one of the things that the Romans did was to raise armies. They raised a lot of armies. And as Rome expanded from the city through the whole boot of Italy, it took 400 years, 300 years. All these different tribes and different cities and regions all gave their soldiers to Rome. So to be a citizen of Rome was to serve in the army. And this there was an inexhaustible supply of soldiers. They didn't use, they didn't hire soldiers. They paid them, of course. But, at the end of the Roman Republic, that broke down, and I'll get to that. Until the Rome was established as a republic, the army wasn't a major portion of it because it was really just a city at the time. And so they would raise their own, they were always fighting. There was a major flaw, incidentally, in their design. The elites, the patricians, really, they formed the Senate, and these were the founding families. It's quite extraordinary. These founding families, to have been a founding family, was a major source of prestige and power and authority. So these patricians, the Senate was formed entirely of patricians.
Were they elected? No,
Well, yeah,
sort of.
yeah. But you know, the Senate was not until the empire did the Senate have, it was not a legislature in the sense that we know it. They elected the officers. There were, besides the consuls, there were other subordinate officers in there. So, and that left, however, a whole lot of other people who didn't have any power at all. That there was a conflict that arose very early about the plebs down here and the elites up here. And so this conflict finally resolved itself into, in about 200, where the plebs were given an assembly of the plebs, of people, and they elected a tribune. This is different from a tribune in the army, incidentally. Tribune in the army is probably something like a battalion commander, and he was one of the elites. The elites fall into the patricians and the equestrians, and this is particularly the equestrians were around for a long time, but it's also money involved. So anything below a tribune didn't have to be an elite, and they were appointed. They were appointed to their positions. It's a political appointment. So this problem of the differentiation of the plebs down here, just the ordinary people, and the elites up here, which had all the power and control, was resolved by creating this this body of plebs, of the people, and who elected their own tribune. And this body is the one that had the power to legislate. Now, Rome was almost always at war. Because there were all these people on the frontier that didn't do what they were supposed to do, or potentially didn't do what they were supposed to do. And so they just kept expanding and expanding. It started really with Carthage. When you get outside of the boot of Italy, with Carthage and southern in northern Africa, and they had these Carthaginian wars. Punic Wars is what they're called, in the middle of the 3rd century. So what happened is that they were going out, the soldiers were going out and fighting by this time outside of the boot of Italy. And you had all these soldiers. Well, most Romans, most people at this time were farmers. And so these soldiers had to leave the farm to go and fight in the wars. the land that they had was theirs. But over hundreds of years, basically, rich people came in and start, while these guys were in, fighting wars, would buy up their farms. And eventually, the farms got, taken up by large landowners. And the soldiers, when they came back, went to the city. So that made the city much more highly populated, standard of living was not real good in the city of Rome. So you had a real disparity here at this time, and the people who were buying up these farms were the elites, the senators class, the patrician class, and the equestrians, and they were getting rich. And the soldiers coming back to the land, and they got in the cities, and it was awful. So about 130 BC, a guy named Gracchus, he was riding out in the country and saw that none of these farms were owned from small farms anymore. There's huge farms, and realizing that he wanted to get back to the real Rome, back to the way it really was. Well, he got himself elected as tribune, and tribunes of the people had enormous authority. Now, you weren't supposed to get elected, and he had this plan to transfer all this land back to the urban soldiers. It was a land reform. He really worked hard on it. And he lasted about a year before he got assassinated. About 130. He didn't last long. But nonetheless, first, one of the things he did was usurp this notion of serving in an office for longer than he should. Right? He just grabbed power and wouldn't let go. There's nothing new under the sun.
Could be today.
10 years later, his brother got elected tribune and carried on this land reform. And this just generated all kinds of grief in the Roman Empire historically. And it started generating political disorder. And starting about 100 BC, this political disorder spread by civil wars, a series of civil wars, a series of populist wars, all kinds of things. And starting in about 60 BC, this kind of filtered down to some major characters, Pompey and others that you may have heard of, and a guy named Caesar, Julius Caesar. And this is where the relationship started to change, because by this time, what would happen is these rich guys would be appointed consul and be appointed generals to an army in Spain or in the East or here or there, and they would raise their armies and pay them. And all of a sudden, you have these generals with their armies that have their allegiance not to Rome, to the Senate of Rome, but to the general that led them. And that started the problem. And it reached its peak about 200
BC,
AD. We're talking just right towards the end of the 1st century BC now. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. So they started fighting each other. And of course, these generals, when their soldiers retired, had to provide a pension for them, and what they usually did was give them land. Saying, so following the Gracchi brothers, they'd take people off the land and replace them with soldiers and stuff like that, or form colonies of various kinds or around, or cities, even towns, and just appropriate the land. So this came to a head starting in about 50 BC, when three folks came together, Julius Caesar, and a gent named Octavian, and one other guy that we all forget because he kind of fades out of history, formed a triad. Just assumed the power and just governed by themselves because they had the power. The Senate, which had no legislative power anyway, was kind of shunted by the side. In 44 BC, we can read, Shakespeare reads about it. The people, well, let me back up a second. The rule was you didn't bring your army into Rome. That was the rule. Actually, not only Rome, but there's a river, in the northern part of Rome, where you cross the Rubicon, yes, the Rubicon River. You weren't allowed to bring an army below the Rubicon. Things were going bad in Rome, so Caesar brought his troops from Gaul, where he'd been fighting Gaul, and he'd had them out there for 5 or 6 years, and created this fighting army, and was very loyal to him. Decided things were so bad in Rome, he just had to take his army across the Rubicon. And so he brought his army into Rome, so you had armies fighting each other. Caesar was so popular that people were talking about making him basically a king. Now, they had, as part of their Roman Republic, a consul could become a dictator for cause. That is to say, and that's the term they use, a dictator, who had exclusive and extensive executive authority. So they didn't use that term, a dictator, but they were gonna elect, there was a rumor that they were gonna elect Julius Caesar as a permanent dictator, which is effectively a king. And it was this horror that the Romans had as of kings that originally started the Republic back in the 500s. This is what brought about his assassination. That left Octavian and Anthony and all these folks fighting over who's got it now, and they had their personal armies. Octavian, who was he was an adopted son of Caesar. It ended up with him and Anthony in a final battle. It was a sea battle off of Greece called Actium. And this was in 31 BC. If you've seen the movie Julius Caesar, or any of that stuff, we're getting into the movie era now. With the Spartacus was a slave and a slave revolt, and Julius Caesar and Anthony and Cleopatra, and we're getting into the biblical era of New Testament movies. Octavian defeated Anthony and Cleopatra at Actium, and they fled back to Egypt. And eventually, Anthony was assassinated, and Cleopatra eventually killed herself, and Julius Caesar, or Octavian, went in and took over Egypt. And Octavian in 28 BC changed things from, he killed the Republic permanently. He named himself Augustus. He assumed titles and authority. He was very clever politically. He did not try to throw out the Senate or become a consul for life or anything like that. He did that. But what he did was assume the powers. He assumed the powers of a consul. He assumed the powers of the tribunes. He assumed all these powers, and he called himself, he was part, a member of the Senate now. He called himself not a dictator, not a king, not a consul, he was a consul, but he called himself princeps, which is prince, a ruler, just a citizen ruler. He was the first citizen. He was the first among equals, and he was politically very astute.
Augustus,
Pardon me?
Augustus.
Augustus was.
Wait, is it Octavian? Also Augustus. Both-
Octavian named
Augustus.
himself Augustus.
Yes, okay, right.
And that started in 28 BC, and Augustus died in 14 AD. This is the beginning of the Pax Romana. He was the emperor, and he was the emperor now. He had direct control over everything.
Now being 28 BC,
Starting in
28 AD,
28 BC, he just had all the power.
and that's Augustus.
He had all the power. They didn't really start calling him emperor until later, but this began the Roman Empire as opposed to the Roman Republic.
Okay,
And he died in 14. Now, just as the Republic had a major flaw, the Empire had a major flaw, and this was a problem of Augustus. He didn't want to be king. One of the characteristics of most monarchies is that they're hereditary. He wanted he didn't provide for succession. And that became the major flaw of the Roman Empire. The problem is the stability between one emperor and the next. One of the things that has made modern governments so stable is the succession is orderly. When the succession gets disorderly, then you got problems. There's nothing new under the sun. And he didn't have a son, and he adopted a son, and all the stuff. Adoption is a major part of Roman culture, and his successors form what they call the Claudio-Julian dynasty, and we know who they are. They're Augustus, Tiberius, who was the emperor when Jesus died. He was the adopted son of Augustus, not the natural son, and he was followed by Gaius, we call him Caligula, and he was followed by Claudius, who Graves wrote the book I, Claudius, you know a lot about him, and he was followed by Nero. The two of these folks were nuts. And so in Nero, who presided over the fire in Rome, who presided over the death of Peter and Paul, he committed suicide under duress. Now he was chased out of office. Basically, he committed suicide in about 66 or 68. This was right in the middle of the war in Palestine. It went from 66 to 70. Vespasian was the general. that was by this time, attacking Masada. Right? And so he committed suicide, and inside of a year, there were 3 emperors, all trying to take over. Vespasian was one. His army in Palestine elected him emperor, and he went into Rome and took it. And he created a dynasty that lasted to the end of the New Testament period. It's called the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, Titus, Domitian. And then there was another third dynasty, basically the Nerva Antonine dynasty, 192, which is basically the time of the disintegration of the empire. Times of trouble, basically. They say, they call it the crisis of the 3rd century. That is to say, the 200s, from about 190 to 300. The Roman Empire had 70 emperors. So it was pretty grim. Closer. So things just kind of fell apart there. But it was awfully peaceful during the period of this first period of empire under Augustus. Let's talk about the classes. Roman was a class-bound society. It is mostly economic classes, but you had these patricians who inherited from the early Romans when the Republic was first founded. They were very wealthy. I mean, super wealthy. There was this class right beneath them who were also of the elite class who were less wealthy. And in order to be a patrician, you had to have a certain, or in the question, you had to have a certain amount of money. And then there were freeborn citizens. Freeborn citizens had rights, Roman rights. Mostly freeborn citizens at this period. In this period were from the Italian root. But you could be, if you born as a freeborn citizen of Rome, such as Paul, because people were emigrating, and so your children were freeborn. In fact, if you're a Roman citizen, you were free and slave. Your slave was a Roman citizen. So that's this Roman citizen was elite because you had a lot of legal rights, and we saw Paul using those legal rights. That's why he said, "I don't want to go to Rome. I don't want to be judged by this Turkey here in Palestine." And when they found and when he was in jail in prison, when they found out that he was a Roman citizen, they immediately released him. So there were all kinds of benefits to that. Then there were freedmen and non-citizen men, which gave you the freedom to engage in all kinds of forms of economics, etc. And so you could make a living. Below that were women and slaves. Now they're put together, Beard puts them together because they really were dependent on somebody else for their status. Women were basically dependent upon men for their status. Now that's it's not quite true, but I'll get to that later, talk about women and slaves separately. And then there were the destitute. Now, in terms of the elite, they were probably, at this time, the empire was about 50 million people. The number of elite, the wealthy, basically, was probably around 200,000 men. out of 50 million. So there was an extraordinary differentiation between the wealthy and the non-wealthy. Basically, from a political perspective, you got the wealthy and everybody else. That's let's talk about how the economic system worked. Primary economic system was source of wealth was land. And that was true all the way until the 19th century worldwide. Land was the major source of wealth until the Industrial Revolution. And that was the primary source of land, and so the senators would go out and buy land. And in fact, the patrician class in particular didn't bother itself with this stuff about making money. They made their money out of rents. Rent is, which is where you receive money for something you aren't working on, for investments, or land holdings, for building ownership, for this kind of stuff. They got all their money from rents. Many of the equestrians did too, but they were also much more engaged in commerce and in contractors for the Roman Empire, for the empire. They would make money that way. And the system, so land was the major source of wealth, but the way the economic system, first part of it was the patron-client system, patronage. This is the Godfather model, basically. People with a lot of money would have clients, and those clients sometimes would be part of their households even. And they owed them allegiance, and the patron owed them loyalty and support, and the clients would do what the patron said. That's a major way the society worked, and how the economy worked. So the patron wouldn't get his hands dirty doing ordinary work, but he would have his clients do it. Would pay him money, and this also became very important during times for the tribunes, when there were the councils of the plebe, where they had the tribunes and meetings of plebes, because the tribunes could buy votes. Inheritance, though, was the major way money was received by this time and retained. This inheritance came to the point where you had a permanent rich class that sometimes weren't very nice people. Rents, where you get income without labor. Contractors. By this time in the Roman Empire, you had a substantial government body of doing things, that did things. For instance, if they want to raise taxes, and so they would contract out for people to it was called tax farming. People would bid with Rome to collect taxes in this area there, and so these were mostly equestrian class, people who gave supplies, got supplies for the Roman army, people who imported the grain to Rome. By this time they were having to feed the city. It was huge. You had 1 million people in Rome. Where are you going to get all the food for that? Well, came by ship, mostly. And so somebody had to ship it in. Then there was a large artisan and merchant class. These were freedmen, freed slaves frequently, or non-citizens of Rome, who made money, by their labor. And they sometimes would congregate together and for mutual interests. You recall in Ephesus, Paul ran into this problem of having a riot amongst the silversmiths because he was telling people not to worship Artemis, but to worship God, and this had effect on the trade. So there was a large trade organization. There was a class called the Infamia, and they were the not so well-respected class. The
Infamous.
and stuff like that. And then the destitute, the huge amount of destitute. And it was just enormous. Understand that at this time, 95% of the empire were agricultural, were rural. Now, actually, that Rome, the urban population was probably around 5%, which is actually high. But all our writing, almost everything we have from this period comes from urban population. And in fact, Paul went to cities, and so did Peter. So, and that's wise, because if you're going to spread the word, you can go to Rome and see 1 million people there, which is more probably than much as all of Palestine. So you go where the people is. I once had a business, I had an ice cream truck, and I went to where the people were, don't you know, to sell my ice cream. So let's talk about labor. And I'm gonna talk about this, and then I'm gonna stop here and pick it up with talking about women. Next week, but let's talk about labor. This took an enormous amount of labor to make things happen. Huge amounts of labor. And that's labor growing things, labor in making things, labor in transporting things, labor in services. Who did the laundry in Rome? Somebody had to do this labor, and it was highly intensive. And we forget, we talk about, we have machines that do something. You know how we measure power machines? Horsepower.
Oh, yeah.
Right. It wasn't until the 19th century that power came from anything but animals, human animals, other animals. So this notion of labor is critical throughout history. Marx is right in his interpretation of history as producers and laborers. This labor thing is intensive. And in a place like Rome, in the ancient world, a major part of that labor came from slaves. This was, how'd you get to be a slave? Well, you sold yourself into slavery. That's one way. Or you could be, if you were involved in a war and lost, you could be a slave after that. Or you could be born to a slave. Significant parts of Rome. It's hard to get a count of this, but it may be as much as 2/3 of the population of the city of Rome were slaves. They really were significantly afraid of slaves. In the, for instance, there were always there was always this fear of the slaves. What kinds of things did we don't know much about the slaves that worked in mines, that worked in ships, that worked out in the fields. Why? Because these folks were just forgotten. What we do know a lot about are household slaves. There's nothing new under the sun. They were frequently integrated into the family. They were integrated into the family household. They weren't part of the household, each individual household. They were frequently well trusted. They did things like tutor their children, and the Greeks were particularly good at this because they wrote well and they knew all the stuff. They were companions, they were business agents, etc. I mean, a person would have a slave go out and do his business for him. And we saw that we see that in the movies.
Do you think the slaves were the same ethnicity as the patricians?
Probably not. There were different peoples.
From other places that sort
Other
of
places,
came in,
absolutely.
brought in?
Yes, yes. So, and they could be, because they were business agents, stuff like that, slaves could accumulate a significant amount of wealth. And they could be better off than, for instance, the freedmen and tradesmen and et cetera, who were working off their own labor. And they could buy their freedom, or they could be manually given their freedom.
Could they become citizens?
If their owner was a citizen, they became a citizen.
Oh.
So, so this was a significant part. Now, this is different, incidentally, from 16th and 18th since modern slavery. Modern slavery is chattel slavery. You couldn't buy your way out of it ordinarily. And in American slavery, or slavery in the Western Hemisphere in particular, it was bad because, first of all, it began because of the labor problem. It's the same root problem. How do you get all this cotton done? Or rice. Originally, it was rice and cane and stuff like this. That's grim work. So how do you get it done? We don't have machines, what you have is human beings. And if you have to pay them too much, you can't make a living doing it. So slavery is how it happened. Chattel slavery in this country was far different. And it's a shame. It's one of our shameful things. Whites determined that the blacks were inferior.
They weren't considered human.
They
at
weren't
one time.
significantly human. That's right. And so therefore, partly on the status of passages like this one that we're studying, would they could be deprived of rights and votes and everything. And it was awful. You couldn't get out of slavery in this country if you had just a teaspoon of black blood. You were a slave. That this is substantially different.
It was either in the Constitution or the Declaration. I think the Constitution, where the slave was considered 2/3 of the Union.
3/5. 3/5.
3/5.
Yes, and that was an economic issue, and it's a problem of labor. How are these folks gonna live in the South with these big farms and doing this labor intensive work? And so that became a political football. So there was this fear of slave revolts. The penalty for murder by a slave of his owner was to kill all the slaves owned by that owner. Death penalty for all of them. So that kind of kept the slaves under control. There was one case that I know of where turns out that the slave owner owned 400 slaves. And that was a lot, and that kind of created a problem. So, and it generated a fear. Spartacus in 73 AD, BC. And I would point now also to Haiti. In 1791 to 1804, there was a slave revolution in Haiti that ran the French out. And in this country, there was a fear of the power of slaves that had a significant effect on our politics. Okay, folks, we're gonna talk next time. I'm gonna do more about this. We'll talk about offices and society as a whole and the status of women and family. And then we'll get to the next, get into the fact of.
History is my favorite subject.